I wanted to add a little bit to the remarks I made in the prior presentation on William of Ockham. William of Ockham, a very fascinating figure because he pushes certain thoughts to such an extreme that he's become rather well known for some of those ideas. And the one that I'd like to zero back in on just a moment is his reflections on, or his position on, the will of God. That for William, the will of God is over everything, and therefore God could do anything. Literally, God could do anything. So God could have made this world to be one in which stealing and murdering and lying and so on were the highest good. And I wanted to say something about that. This is a great, I think, point of not only medieval conversation and debate, but also up into the modern world. Very rarely have I taught a theology class where someone at some point doesn't ask the question, in some way or another, can God make a rock so big that he couldn't lift it? Can God make a rock so big he can't lift it? And of course, the question is intended to be an unsolvable one, because on the one hand, if you say, yes, God could make a rock so big he can't lift it, in the name of God's omnipotence, of course, that God can do anything he wants to do. And so if God wanted to make a rock so big he couldn't lift it, then of course God could do so. On the other hand, if you say, no, God could not do that, then you're compromising God's omnipotence. You're saying that God can't do something. And so it seems to be an unsolvable problem with God's omnipotence to say that there are some things he can't do, or on the other hand, to say that there are some things he can do that would be restricting of God's own nature. So how do we resolve this conundrum? And I think the way that the conundrum is resolved, at least as people like St. Thomas Aquinas will resolve it, is to say that look, the problem here is with the definition of omnipotence. Omnipotence doesn't mean that God can do anything. Omnipotence means that God can do anything that can be done. There are some things that can't be done because they contradict reality. They contradict God's own nature. So, for example, God can't make the past to have never been, for instance. To make the past to have never been is to create a contradiction. It's to say that something was and is, or is and is not, simultaneously at the same time and in the same sense. Or for example, to give another, to say that God could become the devil, or God could cease to exist. If you take omnipotence to mean that God can do anything, then God could become the devil, or God could stop existing. Neither of these would be consistent with God's own being. God is the infinite good, which is exclusive of evil and of the negation of himself. God is self-existent. To say that God could cease to exist would be for God to be self-existent and necessarily existent and potentially non-existent at the same time, which is a contradiction. Doesn't make sense. And so what traditionally is said is that God is omnipotent insofar as God can do anything that he wills to do. And what God wills to do will always be consistent with what God is. God is perfect, infinite being. And therefore, for God to deny his perfect, infinite being would be impossible given the nature of what God is. In other words, God's nature and God's will are one. And that means that God's will never be exercised in such a way that it will negate God's own being. So to go back to the original problem, can God make a rock so big he can't lift it? The answer is no, God can't make a rock so big he can't lift it, because that would be to make the creature to be supreme over himself. That would be to make the created thing to be greater than, or to be outside of the domain of God's providence and God's power. And that, of course, would require, since God is the one causing the rock to even exist, God would have to be supreme over the rock. To say that God could be somehow inferior to the rock is to create a situation that is contrary to the very meaning of creation, the very meaning of rock, the very meaning of material reality, in contrast to the nature of God. So anyhow, I wanted to clarify a few of those concepts relative to William of Ockham.